The movie opens by showing a flashback from 20 years ago, where a chubby schoolboy named Robbie is humiliated by his classmates in a school event. Nobody except Calvin, aka the Golden Jet, saves Bob from humiliation. Back to the present, Calvin is now working as an accountant. We see Calvin's junior assistant got promoted instead of him. Calvin's 20-year high school reunion is coming up, but Calvin doesn't want to go. Calvin is upset because in high school he was voted as most likely to succeed by his classmates and now he is working as an accountant. Meanwhile, someone named Bob Stone sent a friend request to Calvin. As soon as Calvin accepts the request, his telephone rings, but it wasn't Bob. Bob sends messages to Calvin and tells him that he is actually Robbie and invites him to meet up. Calvin meets Bob and he is shocked to see the transformation of Bob's physique. Calvin and Bob hang out at the bar. At the bar, Calvin had an altercation with one guy, and the guy tried to threaten him. Bob jumps in to defend Calvin and confronts the other guys. They show a gun to scare Bob and Calvin, but Bob is not scared at all. Bob tells them that he doesn't like bullies and beats up all of them at the same time. Later Bob asks for Calvin's help with some accounting problem, and since Calvin is an accountant, he agrees to help Bob with the problem. Calvin logs into the account and finds that the account is an auction site and people from all around the world are bidding for something. Suddenly he is locked out of the site and strangely Bob spills beer on the computer. Calvin asks Bob about the things on the account, but Bob tells him that he is seeing them for the first time. Bob stays the night at Calvin's house. The next day 3 CIA agents come to Calvin's house and ask him if he has seen Bob Stone. Calvin tells them that Bob is sleeping on his couch, but Bob disappears. The agents tell him that Bob is wanted for murder and treason and he is planning to sell highly classified state secrets to enemies, which could lead to World War III. From the CIA agents, Calvin finds out that Bob too is a CIA agent. The CIA agents now plan to use Calvin as bait to draw out Agent Bob Stone. Bob calls Calvin at his work. Meanwhile, the CIA is listening to the call. Bob misdirects them and appears in Calvin's office cabin. Calvin tells Bob that he doesn't want any part in Bob's work, but Bob replies that he is already a part of the whole thing. Bob kidnaps Calvin and fights with the CIA agents. Bob puts hot coffee in one of the agents and fights another one of the agent with a banana. One of the agents chokeholds Bob. Bob asks for Calvin's help. Calvin startles and shoots the agent in his ear. While struggling, Calvin accidentally knocks out one of the agents. Bob and Calvin are surrounded by all the agents, but earlier Bob placed a burning cloth that triggers the sprinklers. Bob then throws a flashbang on the floor. Bob shoots the glass and along with Calvin jumps out of the building. They land on an inflated gorilla and run in an Uber car. Bob tells Calvin that an enemy of the state named the Black Badger stole the encryption key to the entire US satellite program and he plans to sell it to potential buyers through the auction site Calvin logged in earlier. If they lose control of the satellites, the US will be completely vulnerable to terrorist attacks. That's why Bob contacted Calvin to help him find the transaction number of the winning bid. That number will tell Bob the location where the deal is going on so that he can take down the Black Badger. Bob explains to Calvin that the Black Badger killed his partner Phil, and everybody thinks that he has done it. We see a flashback of the last interaction between Bob and Phil at their mission. Suddenly, they are attacked by a guy on a bike. It turns out that Bob knows the guy took the bounty to bring Bob dead or alive. Meanwhile, Calvin runs away from Bob on a dirt bike. Soon he is picked up by the CIA agents. He tells the agents that he has no association with Bob. The agents tell him that the Black Badger is an imaginary enemy created by Agent Bob and that Bob has some psychological problems. Bob Stone is the Black Badger and he betrayed his partner Phil to cover his tracks. Agent Pam told Calvin that Bob needed the transaction number to get the location for the meetup to sell the secrets to the highest bidder. They give Calvin a device and tell him to activate it the next time he is with Bob. Later, the agents threaten Calvin that they will arrest his wife and him for treason if they don't cooperate. Calvin, not having any choice, gives them the location of him and Bob. Agents surrounded the place and arrested Bob. Agent Harris interrogates Bob and locks up Calvin. Calvin uses a banana to trick the agents and frees himself. He then goes to the interrogation room and frees Bob. The agents find them, but Bob takes them out with the help of Calvin. Bob tells Calvin that the transaction numbers are the longitude and latitude of the location where the exchange will happen. After getting the location of the buyer, Calvin and Bob steal a plane to get there. In the middle of the flight, they run out of fuel and their plane starts free-falling. But it turns out Bob faked it to scare Calvin. They reach the place but no buyer is there. Calvin points out that the exchange is probably taking place in the parking lot beneath them. Calvin stays above and Bob goes to the parking lot underground. Bob pretends to be the seller and meets the buyer. Meanwhile, Calvin sees Agent Harris coming, he goes to warn Bob, and Bob shoots Calvin to prevent any suspicion. Also, we see Bob's former partner Phil, whom everyone thought was dead, is alive. Phil tells the buyer that he is the real Black Badger and Bob is just pretending to be him. Meanwhile, the CIA agents storm the place and a shootout takes place between them and the buyers. Calvin sees state secret codes and takes them under his control. The buyers start to follow him, but Bob saves him. Both Bob and Phil approach Calvin for the secret codes and each tells him that they are good guys and that the other one is bad. Suddenly they start shooting each other with Calvin in the middle. Calvin picks up a gun and accidentally shoots Bob. Phil revealed himself to be the Black Badger and he faked his death to get away with stolen money and frame Bob for it. Phil is about to execute Calvin, but Calvin does his signature backflip to distract him and Bob takes Phil down. They return the secret satellite codes to the CIA. Calvin and Bob arrive at their school reunion in a CIA helicopter.